Marcus found out he'd been erased from his own company through an email. Not a phone call, not a conversation, not even a proper meeting. A routine investor update, CC'd to him by mistake, referring to him in the past tense. Marcus's departure last quarter allowed us to restructure the cap table more efficiently. He read that sentence 4 times before it fully landed. He hadn't departed anything. As far as he knew, he still owned 30% of the company he'd spent 4 years building from a shared apartment with his best friend into something that had just closed a $12 million funding round. He called Derek immediately. Derek didn't pick up. He texted. No response for 6 hours. When Derek finally called back, his voice had a strange, careful calm to it, the tone of someone who had rehearsed this conversation many times before actually having it. "There's some paperwork we need to go over," Derek said. "It's complicated. I'll explain everything." He never really did. And by the time Marcus understood exactly what had happened, it was already too late to stop most of it. What made it worse, Marcus would say later, wasn't the shock of the email itself. It was realizing, in the hours that followed, that Derek had clearly known this moment was coming for a while, long enough to prepare a calm voice and a vague explanation, long enough that the surprise, whatever there had been of it, belonged entirely to Marcus. 4 years earlier, Marcus and Derek had been the kind of business partners people write case studies about. College roommates who stayed close after graduation, who spent 2 years building a logistics software company out of Marcus's spare bedroom before it turned into anything real. Marcus handled product and engineering. He was the one who actually understood the technical problem they were solving, who wrote the first version of the platform almost entirely alone, who stayed up nights fixing bugs before early customers noticed them. Derek handled the business side, sales, investor relationships, the parts of running a company that required a different kind of charm than Marcus had ever had. For the first 3 years, the split felt fair. Marcus trusted Derek completely with the parts of the business he didn't understand as well, the legal structuring, the cap table, the fundraising paperwork. That trust wasn't naive, it was earned, built over a decade of friendship that predated the company by years. Derek had been at Marcus's wedding. Marcus had been the one who drove Derek to the hospital at 2 in the morning when Derek's father had a heart attack. This channel tells stories about the justice that finds people eventually, quietly, on its own timeline, without anyone having to force it. If that's the kind of story you're here for, subscribe now, because there's a new one every week. When the company raised its first serious round of funding in year 3, $12 million from a well-known venture fund, it should have been the best moment of both their lives. Marcus remembers it that way, mostly. What he didn't fully register at the time was how much of the actual paperwork, the equity restructuring that came with taking outside investment, ran entirely through Derek and the fund's lawyers, with Marcus signing documents he trusted more than he read carefully, because that was simply how the partnership had always worked. Friends who knew them both back then describe a dynamic that seemed, at the time, like a genuinely healthy division of labor. Marcus built things. Derek explained things, to investors, to the board, occasionally back to Marcus himself, in the confident, simplifying language of someone who always seemed to already understand the parts Marcus found tedious. Nobody watching from the outside would have guessed that confidence was slowly becoming something else entirely. Looking back, Marcus could identify the moment things started shifting, roughly 2 months before the email. Derek started scheduling investor calls without looping him in beforehand, something that broke from years of habit. When Marcus asked about it, Derek waved it off as just trying to save everyone's time, nothing that needed a whole meeting. Around the same time, a new hire named Priya joined as VP of Operations, reporting, oddly, directly to Derek rather than through the normal structure. Marcus didn't think much of it at first. Companies reorganize. People get new titles. It's what growth looks like from the inside, messy and a little inconsistent. But there was one afternoon, about 3 weeks before everything came apart, when Marcus walked into a conference room to grab a marker and found Derek and Priya deep in conversation, papers spread across the table, both of them going quiet the second they noticed him in the doorway. Derek smiled immediately, said something about vendor contracts, and the moment passed. Marcus didn't ask a single follow-up question. There was no reason to yet, or so it seemed at the time. There was also a smaller, easier-to-dismiss detail Marcus only remembered clearly much later. Derek had started referring to the company, in casual conversation, as "what I'm building," rather than the "we" that had defined every conversation between them for years. It was such a minor shift in language that Marcus never consciously registered it in the moment. The kind of thing that only makes sense in hindsight, once you already know how the story ends. It took Marcus almost 3 weeks of digging, and a lawyer he hired with money he genuinely couldn't afford to spend, to understand the full shape of what had happened. During the funding round 18 months earlier, Derek had structured a series of amendments to the company's equity agreements, technically legal, buried inside dozens of pages of standard-looking fundraising paperwork that gradually diluted Marcus's ownership far more aggressively than the round itself required. A vesting cliff reset here. A newly created option pool there, allocated almost entirely to hires Derek had brought in directly, including Priya. Each individual change looked, on paper, like a normal part of scaling a company. Stacked together, over 18 months, they had quietly reduced Marcus's ownership from 30% to just under 4%. The final piece, the one that actually pushed him out entirely, was a clause Marcus had signed nearly a year earlier, believing it was standard investor-requested language about company governance. In reality, it gave the board, which by that point consisted of Derek, one investor representative, and Priya, the authority to remove any officer, including a co-founder, without cause, given a unanimous board vote. Marcus had provided that unanimous vote himself, months earlier, on an unrelated governance matter he'd barely paid attention to, never realizing the same mechanism could later be turned against him directly. His lawyer was blunt about it during their second meeting. Every individual document was defensible. Together, they formed a pattern that would be extraordinarily difficult and expensive to challenge in court, especially against a well-funded company with in-house counsel and Marcus's own dwindling savings account. He didn't break the law, the lawyer told him. He used it, carefully, over a long time in a way that would hold up. Marcus sat with that sentence for a long time after the call ended. What stayed with him longest wasn't any single document. It was the realization that this hadn't been a moment of weakness or a single bad decision under pressure. It had been a plan, executed patiently across 18 months, requiring Derek to sit across from him at dinner, at the office, at their mutual friends' weddings, all while quietly building the mechanism that would eventually remove him. That kind of patience, Marcus would say later, was the part he found hardest to forgive. The hardest part wasn't the money, though the money mattered plenty. Marcus had put 4 years of his life, his entire 20s really, into a company that no longer legally recognized him as anything more than a former employee with a small, mostly worthless sliver of equity. The hardest part was realizing that the friendship had been, in some very real sense, a resource Derek had been managing the entire time, alongside the investors and the board and the hiring pipeline. Every late night, every inside joke, every moment Marcus had trusted Derek with something that mattered, had existed in the same relationship where Derek was simultaneously, patiently, restructuring him out of what they'd built together. He thought about calling his parents to explain why the company they'd been proud of, the one he'd talked about at every family dinner for 4 years, no longer had a place for him in it. He didn't, not for another 2 weeks. He needed time to understand what he was even going to say, because "my best friend legally erased me from my own company" wasn't a sentence that felt real yet, even though he'd read every document proving it was. He also found himself, in those first weeks, replaying old memories through a new, uncomfortable lens. The late night 4 years earlier, when Derek had convinced him to take the initial seed investment on terms Marcus had privately worried about. The argument, 2 years in, over hiring decisions, that Marcus had eventually let go rather than push further. Small moments that had felt, at the time, like the normal friction of running a company together, now looked like something else entirely, early signs of a partner who was used to eventually getting his way. Marcus's lawyer laid out the options plainly. He could sue. It would likely take 2 to 3 years, cost more in legal fees than his remaining equity was probably worth, and the outcome, given how carefully the paperwork had been constructed, was far from guaranteed. Marcus thought about it for exactly 1 week. Then he made a decision that surprised even people who knew him well. He wasn't going to fight for a seat at a table he no longer wanted to sit at. He negotiated a small settlement, enough to cover his legal fees and give him a few months of runway, signed the separation agreement, and walked away. This wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even really peace. It was closer to a calculation. Spending the next 3 years of his life in litigation against Derek, reliving this betrayal in depositions and court filings, wasn't a life he wanted, regardless of how the case eventually turned out. He'd rather build something new than spend years proving a point to someone who'd already shown him, clearly, exactly who he was. A few close friends pushed back when he told them the decision. One asked him directly if he was worried about looking weak, about letting Derek get away with it entirely. Marcus didn't have a fully satisfying answer for that at the time, only a strong instinct that chasing a courtroom victory would cost him something he wasn't willing to spend. Years of his life aimed backward, at a person who no longer deserved that much of his attention. The next 18 months were, by Marcus's own account, the hardest and most clarifying stretch of his adult life. He took a contracting job to cover rent, the kind of unglamorous engineering work he hadn't done since before the company, while spending nights and weekends building something new, alone this time, a much smaller tool solving a narrower problem he understood intimately from his years in the industry. He was careful, this time, in a way he hadn't been before. Every agreement with a future co-founder or early hire went through a lawyer he actually trusted, someone who explained every clause instead of assuming Marcus's trust would fill the gaps. He kept ownership simple, kept the structure simple, kept the number of people with any authority over him deliberately small. He didn't follow Derek's company closely. He made a conscious choice not to, unfollowing the old shared accounts, muting mentions, avoiding the industry gossip that occasionally drifted his way through mutual contacts. Not because he didn't care what happened to it, but because caring too much about it felt like handing Derek even more of his attention than he'd already taken. His new company grew slowly, carefully, nothing like the $12 million headline round of his previous one. But it was entirely, unmistakably his, in a way the first company, it turned out, had never really been. There was a particular afternoon, about a year into building the new company, when a potential early hire asked him, half-jokingly, why he insisted on such formal, over-explained agreements for such a small team. Marcus remembers laughing, briefly, before answering honestly. Because the last time he trusted a verbal understanding over careful paperwork, it had cost him everything he'd built. He wasn't going to make that particular mistake twice. Almost 2 years after Marcus left, a mutual contact forwarded him a trade publication article, unprompted, with a single line of commentary. Thought you'd want to see this. The article covered a wave of departures at Derek's company, 3 senior engineers, and the entire original data science team, all within a 6-week window. The piece was vague about the reasons, citing only internal restructuring and strategic realignment, the same kind of bloodless corporate language that had once described Marcus's own removal. Marcus read it once, felt an unexpected flicker of something that wasn't quite satisfaction, closer to simple recognition, and went back to his own work. He didn't reach out to any of the departed engineers to ask what had happened. He didn't post anything. He genuinely wasn't trying to find out more. But the article stayed in the back of his mind for a while, not because he wanted something bad to happen to Derek, he told a friend later, but because it was the first real sign that whatever Derek had built might not be as solid underneath as it had looked from the outside, back when Marcus was still inside it. He didn't mention the article to anyone else for months. It felt, somehow, like something private, not because it was a secret, but because he wasn't entirely sure yet what he felt about it, and he'd learned, since the split, to sit with complicated feelings for a while before deciding what they actually meant. The full story came out roughly 8 months later, and it came out because of people who had absolutely nothing to do with Marcus. A group of investors from a later funding round, ones Marcus had never even met, filed a formal complaint alleging that Derek had misrepresented the company's revenue figures during their due diligence process, inflating annual recurring revenue by a margin serious enough to trigger an independent financial audit. The audit, once it started, apparently didn't stop at revenue. It reportedly found irregularities going back years, including some of the very same equity restructuring maneuvers that had pushed Marcus out, this time used against other early employees who'd had far less legal protection than Marcus had managed to secure for himself. Marcus learned most of this the way everyone else in the industry did, through a slow drip of reporting from a business journalist who'd apparently been investigating the company for months. He wasn't the source. He wasn't quoted anywhere in the coverage. He was, for the first time in 2 years, simply a bystander watching a story unfold that he'd once been trapped inside of. He read the first article twice, carefully, half expecting to feel something dramatic. Mostly what he felt was a strange, quiet steadiness, the sense of watching a pattern he already understood intimately finally become visible to everyone else, on its own schedule, without him needing to explain or prove anything to anyone. Within 4 months of the audit's findings becoming public, the company's board, the same structure Derek had once used to remove Marcus, voted to remove Derek as CEO. The investors who had once trusted him completely now had, in writing, documented reasons not to. The clean mechanism he'd built to control the company had, in the end, worked exactly as designed, just no longer in his favor. The company itself didn't fully collapse. It limped on for a while under new leadership, a shadow of what it had been at its funding peak, eventually getting acquired for a fraction of its previous valuation, mostly to absorb its remaining engineering talent and quietly wind down the rest. Derek, according to the reporting Marcus read like everyone else in the industry, settled the investor lawsuit privately, on terms nobody made public, and largely disappeared from the startup scene that had once celebrated him as a rising star. A few people who'd worked with him mentioned, in industry forums Marcus stumbled across more than once, that he'd moved to a different city and taken a much quieter operating role at a company nobody had heard of. Marcus didn't celebrate when he read the final wrap-up article. He noticed that about himself, actually, expected to feel triumphant, and instead just feeling a kind of quiet, settled recognition. The story had ended the way stories like this usually do, not with revenge, but with the truth simply catching up to someone who'd spent years outrunning it. He thought, briefly, about reaching out to Priya, wondering whether she'd been a willing participant in what happened to him or simply someone who trusted the wrong person the same way he once had. He decided against it. Some questions, he'd come to realize, didn't need answers to stop mattering as much as they once had. 3 years after walking away from the company he'd built with Derek, Marcus's second company had 11 employees, profitable revenue, and no outside investors at all. It was smaller than what he'd once had, by every metric that used to matter to him. It was also, he says now, the first thing he's built that has never once made him feel like he needed to protect himself from the people closest to it. He doesn't think about Derek often anymore. When people ask him about the story, and a surprising number of people in the industry eventually heard some version of it, he tells it plainly, without much anger left in his voice. Not because he's fully made peace with what happened. He's honest that some of that is still there, but because he's found that the story matters less to him now than the company he actually built afterward. The one thing Marcus says he learned, the thing he tells other founders when they ask for advice about partnerships, isn't about revenge or watching for karma. It's about paperwork. Read everything, he says. Understand every clause, even the ones your closest friend hands you with a reassuring smile. Trust is not a substitute for understanding what you're actually signing. He never went looking for what happened to Derek. He never needed to engineer it, plan it, or wait for it on purpose. It simply happened, on its own timeline, built entirely out of decisions Derek made without Marcus anywhere near the room. If this story reminded you that some debts get collected without anyone forcing the issue, subscribe, because next week we're telling another story about the justice nobody has to chase to see it arrive. What do you think? Would you have fought for your equity in court, or walked away and rebuilt like Marcus did? Tell us in the comments. Sometimes the most satisfying ending isn't the one you write yourself. It's the one that arrives quietly, months or years later, built entirely out of choices someone else made when they thought no one who mattered was still watching.